Let's break it down. I'm Imran, a Middle East based analyst, and today we are looking at a story that may sound like it is only about one port in Iran. But actually, this is about India, Iran, the United States, Pakistan, China, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the future of regional trade. The port is called Chabahar. And for India, Chabahar is not just a port, it is a strategic door, a door that allows India to reach Afghanistan and Central Asia without passing through Pakistan. Now, that door is under pressure because a US sanctions waiver that allowed India to keep working on Chabahar expired on April 26, 2026. And now the big question is this: is India about to lose one of its most important strategic projects in the region? To understand this, we need to go step by step. First, where is Chabahar? Chabahar is located on Iran's southeastern coast in the Gulf of Oman. It is not far from the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil routes in the world. But for India, the most important thing is not only the sea, it is the map behind the sea. From Chabahar, goods can move into Iran, then toward Afghanistan, and then further into Central Asia. That means countries like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and even routes toward Russia become more reachable. Now ask yourself one simple question. Why does India need this route? Because Pakistan sits between India and Afghanistan. And because India and Pakistan have long-standing political and security tensions, India cannot simply depend on a land route through Pakistan. So Chabahar gives India another option. Instead of sending goods through Pakistan, India can send them by sea to Iran, unload them at Chabahar, and then move them northward by road and rail. In simple words, Chabahar helps India bypass Pakistan. That is why this port has always been so important. Now let's go back in history. India and Iran first started discussing Chabahar seriously around 2003. But for many years, the project moved very slowly. The main reason was US sanctions on Iran. Whenever sanctions became tighter, companies became afraid, banks became afraid, insurance companies became afraid, shipping companies became afraid, because doing business with Iran could create legal and financial problems. Then came a major opening in 2015. The Iran nuclear deal reduced some sanctions pressure. India saw the opportunity and moved faster. In 2016, Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Iran and India announced major commitments for Chabahar. The idea was clear. India would help develop and operate part of the port, especially the Shahid Beheshti terminal. Later, India Ports Global Limited, a government-owned Indian company, took over operations. In May 2024, India and Iran signed a 10-year agreement for equipping and operating the Shahid Beheshti terminal. At that moment, it looked like Chabahar was finally becoming a long-term Indian strategic asset. But then the problem returned. US sanctions. When Donald Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 during his first term, sanctions on Iran came back strongly. India had a problem. It wanted to continue Chabahar, but it also wanted strong relations with the United States. So India lobbied Washington, and at that time, the US allowed a special exemption for Chabahar. Why? Because Chabahar was also useful for Afghanistan. It helped move goods and humanitarian supplies into Afghanistan without depending fully on Pakistan. So for years, India managed to balance both sides. It worked with Iran on Chabahar, and at the same time, it kept strong ties with Washington. This is what India often calls strategic autonomy, not fully joining one camp, not fully cutting off another, but keeping multiple doors open. However, strategic autonomy becomes difficult when big powers apply pressure. And that is what is happening now. In 2025, the US moved to revoke Iran-related sanctions exemptions, including the Chabahar waiver. India again tried to manage the situation. A temporary extension was reportedly given until April 26, 2026. But now that date has passed, and India has to decide what to do: continue and risk US sanctions, exit and lose a strategic project, or find a middle path. This is where the situation becomes very interesting. Reports suggest India has been discussing options with Iran. One possible option is to temporarily transfer India's operational stake or role to an Iranian entity. That way, Indian companies may reduce direct exposure to US sanctions. But India may still try to preserve a future path back into the project. In simple words, India may step back without fully walking away. That sounds clever, but it is also risky because if you step back from a strategic asset, someone else can step in. And in this region, the obvious concern for India is China. Now let's bring Pakistan and China into the picture. Just east of Chabahar, on Pakistan's coast, there is another port called Gwadar. Gwadar has been developed with major Chinese support under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Gwadar and Chabahar are not very far from each other. So for many analysts, Gwadar represents China's strategic presence on Pakistan's coast, and Chabahar represents India's answer on Iran's coast. This does not mean both ports are only military projects. They are commercial ports too. But in geopolitics, ports are never just about trade. Ports can become logistics points. Ports can support naval access. Ports can shape influence. Ports can decide who controls the flow of goods, energy, and power. So if India loses operational control or influence in Chabahar, China's Gwadar advantage becomes more visible. India would still have maritime strength, but its land access into Central Asia would become weaker. And this is where the bigger problem begins. Chabahar is also connected to the International North-South Transport Corridor. This corridor is designed to connect India with Iran, Central Asia, Russia, and Europe through a mix of sea, road, and rail routes. For India, this corridor is important because it reduces dependence on traditional routes and creates more options for trade. But if Chabahar becomes politically risky or operationally frozen, the corridor becomes less useful. A corridor is only powerful when its key nodes are working, and Chabahar is one of those key nodes. Now let's look at India's dilemma from three angles. First, the strategic angle. India needs Chabahar to bypass Pakistan and reach Afghanistan and Central Asia. Without Chabahar, India's regional connectivity becomes weaker. Second, the diplomatic angle. India wants good relations with the United States. The US is important for technology, defense, investment, and balancing China. So India cannot simply ignore US sanctions pressure. Third, the Iran angle. Iran is also important for India, not just because of Chabahar, but because Iran sits at a critical geographic position between South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Russia. So India does not want to lose Iran completely to China or other powers. This is the uncomfortable reality. India wants access to Iran. India wants partnership with the US. India wants to counter China. India wants to bypass Pakistan. But all these goals are now colliding at Chabahar. So what happens next? There are three possible scenarios. Scenario 1, India finds a legal workaround. This could mean a temporary transfer arrangement, reduced Indian visibility, or some kind of structure that protects Indian companies from sanctions. In this case, India does not fully leave Chabahar. It simply lowers its exposure until the geopolitical weather improves. This would be the best case scenario for India. Scenario 2, the US and Iran eventually return to some kind of negotiated settlement. If sanctions pressure reduces in the future, India could re-enter Chabahar more openly. In that case, the current step back would be temporary. India would say, we protected our position, waited for the right moment, and returned. Scenario 3. Sanctions remain tight for years. This is the worst case scenario for India because infrastructure needs maintenance, ports need investment, operations need staff, equipment, insurance, banking, and shipping networks. If India is absent for too long, Chabahar may slowly become a project India paid for but cannot use properly. And in geopolitics, unused assets lose value. Now, some people may ask, why doesn't India just defy the US? The answer is simple because the cost could be high. Indian companies dealing with Chabahar could face restrictions. Banks may refuse transactions. Shipping firms may avoid the route. International insurers may hesitate. So even if India politically wants to continue, the commercial system may not cooperate. Sanctions do not only stop governments, they scare the entire business ecosystem. That is why the Chabahar issue is not just about political will. It is about banking, shipping, insurance, compliance, and risk. Now, on the other side, some people may say, why doesn't India simply leave Chabahar? That is also not easy because leaving Chabahar would mean India loses years of strategic effort. It would weaken India's access to Afghanistan and Central Asia. It would reduce India's ability to balance China's presence in Gwadar. And it would send a message that US pressure can force India to step away from its long-term regional projects. That is not a comfortable message for a country that wants to be seen as an independent global power. So India is trapped between two bad options: stay and face sanctions risk, leave and face strategic loss. That is why New Delhi is likely looking for a middle path, not a dramatic exit, not a reckless confrontation, but a controlled adjustment, a way to protect its future position without triggering immediate penalties. Now let's also be fair, Chabahar is not dead. A waiver expiry does not automatically mean the project disappears overnight. India and Iran still have strategic reasons to keep the door open. Iran needs partners, India needs access. Central Asia needs trade routes. Afghanistan needs connectivity. So the logic of Chabahar still exists. But the problem is that geopolitics can block even logical projects. That is the lesson here. Sometimes a project makes perfect geographic sense. It makes economic sense. It makes regional sense. But if it clashes with sanctions and great power rivalry, it can still get stuck. And this is exactly what Chabahar represents. It is a port caught between maps and power. On the map, Chabahar is India's gateway. In politics, it is a pressure point. For India, the next few months will be important. If New Delhi can preserve its role through a temporary arrangement, then Chabahar remains alive. If the US position hardens and Iran remains isolated, then India may slowly lose practical control. And if China expands influence in the region while India steps back, then the strategic cost becomes even bigger. So the real story is not simply India may lose a port. The real story is, can India still practice strategic autonomy when the pressure comes directly from one of its most important partners? Can India maintain ties with Iran while deepening ties with America? Can India counter China without triggering sanctions? And can a country become a major global power while still depending on other powers' permission for strategic projects? That is the deeper question. Chabahar is a test case, not only for India's Iran policy, but for India's whole foreign policy model. Because in today's world, countries do not only compete through armies, they compete through ports, through corridors, through sanctions, through supply chains, through shipping routes, through infrastructure, and through who controls the doors between regions. For India, Chabahar was one of those doors. Now that door is not closed, but it is under pressure. And whether India can keep it open will tell us a lot about the future balance of power in South Asia, Central Asia, and the wider Indian Ocean region. So, is India losing Chabahar? Not yet, but India is definitely being forced to make a difficult choice. And the final outcome will depend on whether New Delhi can protect its long-term strategy without crossing Washington's red lines. That is the real balancing act. And that is why this sport matters far more than it first appears. Let's keep watching this closely because sometimes the biggest geopolitical shifts do not begin with a war. They begin with a port, a waiver, and a deadline. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe to Imran Breaks It Down, like this video, and share it with someone who follows geopolitics, India, Iran, or global trade. Because here, we don't just follow headlines, we break them down.